They are the Imperium's most closely guarded secret, a chapter of warrior psychers so elite that anyone who glimpses them is never allowed to remember it. This is the story of what it truly costs to stand inside the Grey Knights. The door opened 40 seconds early. I know this because I had been counting. The supply manifest had directed me to Deck 7's secondary cargo bay, and the access corridor between Deck 8 and Deck 7 had a transit rhythm. I had walked 11 times in 3 months. The 2 locked junctions, the decontamination arch, the final sealed pressure door that should not cycle until the 1300 bell. I was there at 12:59 and 40 seconds. I was counting because I had nothing else to do. The manifest discrepancy had already cost me 20 minutes. I had already found the wrong case in the wrong bay on the wrong deck. I was standing in a featureless corridor with a supply checklist and the particular focused patience of someone who has learned, over the course of a long Munitorum career, that incorrect manifests are not personal. The door opened, and I stopped counting. They came through in a column of 2, 8 of them. The corridor is 3.5 meters wide at that junction, and they nearly filled it, not with their bodies alone, because 8 could have fitted with space remaining, but with what surrounded them. There is no clinical term for this. I have tried to find one, and there is not one. A field of wrongness preceded them at the boundary of perception. A pressure that was not sound and not light, but that I received through some faculty that Medicae training does not cover and that the Catechism does not name. My vision went uniformly pale at the edges for 2 seconds. My back teeth ached in a way that was deep and specific, and then stopped. The recycled air of the corridor tasted briefly of something I could not categorize: cold stone, void temperature, something aged and deliberate and enormous brought very close. I did not move. They wore Aegis plate. I knew the designation from codex entries I had studied during a posting to an Ordo Militarum facility 6 years prior, where the reference library included materials I had not been explicitly forbidden from reading. Silver-gray ceramite, covered in text worked into the metal itself, not applied as though the armor had been grown around the words over decades, the high Gothic seeping into the molecular structure of the plate. Each stood perhaps 3 meters. They moved with the stillness inside motion that I have seen in senior inquisitorial staff and in veteran surgeons who have worked enough trauma to become calibrated against it. The quality of someone who does not perform competence, because competence has become the ground they walk on rather than the thing they are trying to maintain. They were moving toward me and not seeing me yet. They had come through the pressure door with the assurance of people who have not expected to find anyone in a sealed corridor because the corridor should not have had anyone in it. In the 6 seconds before the last figure turned, I had a clear sight line through the open pressure door to the cargo bay beyond. The bodies were arranged in 3 rows. I counted them because counting is the reflex of my profession. The first thing trained into a Medicae before anything else, because the number matters and the number must be accurate. 17. Imperial Guardsmen in standard issue flak, rifles still in some of their hands, positioned with a precision that was not the precision of men who had fallen. They had been placed. The rows were even. The spacing between them was consistent. Their faces were turned upward, and their expressions were, I have returned to this detail more times than I can account for, trying to find the accurate word, and I cannot. Not peace. Peace implies resolution. This was absence, the way a room is empty. The content was gone, and the vessel remained, and the vessel was arranged correctly, as if by someone who understood that the vessels would be found and wanted them found in order. I had 17 seconds before the column of figures fully cleared the threshold and the last one turned. Then the last one turned. He was the justicar. I know this now, having had time to understand the rank markings, the ornamentation on the pauldron, the iconography worked into the helm's faceplate, the particular configuration of the force weapon sheathed at his back. At the time I knew only that he was different from the others in some way I could read without being able to name. The same way you read the difference between a senior and junior Medicae before you know their ranks. Something in the axis of movement, the quality of stillness, the weight of accumulated decisions carried in the body. He saw me. He raised one gauntleted hand, not toward me but sideways, toward the column behind him. They stopped. All 7 of them, mid-step, simultaneous, without sound. He crossed the corridor to me in 4 steps. He crouched. I want to record this clearly because it felt significant at the time and has continued to feel significant in the months since. He did not remain standing and address the top of my head. He did not gesture for me to approach. He brought 3 meters of silver-gray power armor and an unknown number of combat centuries, and whatever he had just done in that sealed bay, down to the level of my eyes. His helm was expressionless, the faceplate blank silver, no reading of the face behind it possible. His Nemesis Force weapon was sheathed. His gauntleted hands rested on the floor in front of him for balance, casually, the way a very large and very composed person rests their hands when crouching. The scale of him at that distance produced no fear in me that I could identify. It produced something more structural, a recalibration of the space I was standing in, a new understanding of what the corridor contained and therefore what I was. State your name and function. His voice was level, precise, without inflection, not unkind, not kind either. It was a voice from which those categories had been removed, not through cruelty, but through the long practice of dealing in things that did not benefit from the application of those categories. I told him. I gave my name and my designation Secundus Medicae, Munitorum Pool, attached to the thrown adamant for the duration of the current operation, and my voice was steady because voices are instruments, and instruments can be maintained regardless of what the body that holds them is doing. He repeated my name, once, quietly, a single repetition that had the character of something being placed somewhere it would be kept. The back of my neck went cold in a way that traveled down through my shoulders and did not warm again for some time. Accompany me. I accompanied him. We moved through the thrown adamant through sections I had not previously accessed. The junctions required his gauntlet against reader pads that accepted it without sound, without pause. A lift descended 3 decks without stopping. A corridor narrowed and then widened into a familiar layout, the Medicae deck, recognizable by the smell and the ceiling configuration, and we arrived at the door of my bay. The bay I had worked in for 3 months, where the supply drawers were arranged in the order I had arranged them, where the monitoring equipment was calibrated to my preferences, where the junior medics came to me with questions. The door was open. 2 more grey knights stood inside, along the far wall, positioned with the particular stationary quality of people who could remain in any position indefinitely without fatigue. Between them, at my supply cataloging table, the table I had cleared of a 2-month accumulation of formed duplicates 3 weeks ago, sat a man in a grey coat. He was reviewing a handheld cogitator with the focused disinterest of someone auditing accounts they have not been asked to enjoy. He looked up when the justicar entered. He looked at me the way a cogitator looks at a data entry. Checking format. Checking that the fields were populated in the correct schema. He was an inquisitor. The rosette at his collar was Ordo Malas. I recognized it from the non-response stamped with one I had received 3 months ago when I filed a query about the mission's classification. He did not introduce himself. His voice was moderate and professional. Have you filed any communications in the past hour? No, I said. He made a mark on the cogitator. He said, return to your duties, file no reports and speak to none of your colleagues until I contact you. Do you understand? I said I understood. He returned his attention to the cogitator. The justicar did not move from the doorway. I stepped around him and returned to the supply inventory I had been attempting to complete, and completed it with hands that were steady enough, and returned to the bay and began the afternoon shift. The bay smelled wrong for the rest of the afternoon. Not badly wrong, just wrong in the specific way that a space smells when it has been occupied by things that exist at the boundary of what the Imperium officially acknowledges. Cold stone and void temperature and something older than either, pulled through from wherever they had come from and left in the recycled air like the residue of incense after the ceremony has ended. I administered 4 scheduled medication doses. I supervised a junior medic through a dressing change. I completed the inventory. I signed the intake forms for a new casualty transfer from the vessel's brief engagement 3 days prior, a wound going septic due to insufficient field dressing, survivable with intervention. I intervened. I filled the forms. In the 4th hour of the afternoon, Ferren came in. She was a colleague, a fellow Munitorum pool medicae, attached to this vessel on the same rotation I was, assigned to the secondary bay 1 deck down. We had shared 3 night shifts, and she had good clinical instincts and a careful way of asking questions, the kind of careful that comes from learning early that questions have costs. She came into the bay to retrieve a calibration tool from the equipment rack. She retrieved it. She was leaving when she said it. She said something strange had happened near Deck 7. She had been passing the junction on an errand, and there was a quiet. She described it specifically, not silence, but quiet, a quality of removed sound, as though the sound had been taken from the air instead of simply not present. She said it made her feel, briefly, as though she had been somewhere else and returned. She asked if I had heard anything unusual. I said no. She nodded. She left with the calibration tool. 1 hour later, she was not at the evening shift handover. Her name was absent from the posted rotation without a replacement, without a noted absence, without any administrative indication that a gap had been created and filled or was being managed. Her instruments were racked where she had placed them that afternoon. In the attached rest alcove, her bunk held the shaped impression of the body that usually occupied it. Her personal effects were arranged. Her assigned reading material was bookmarked to a page she had not finished. The manifest had been corrected. I found this by accident by cross-referencing the ration allocation request I filed every evening, which requires the current vessel complement to be correct, and finding that the number had changed by 1 without any accompanying notice. Manifests change when people are transferred or when casualties occur and are processed. This change had no accompanying record. There was no transfer notation, no mortality entry, no disciplinary flag, no administrative comment of any kind. She was not in the manifest. The number was internally consistent. The roster summed correctly. She had been removed from the system with the precision you apply to a clerical error, the original entry crossed, the correct entry initialed. Everything in order, nothing to indicate that the original entry had ever represented a person. I filed nothing. I said nothing. I reported for the 0600 shift and performed it correctly. At 0930 I was summoned. A runner in standard Munitorum grey appeared at the bay entrance and said I was required and led me through 3 decks of increasing restriction into a part of the vessel I had not been in. 2 checkpoints. A lift I had not used. A corridor that narrowed at an unusual angle, the kind of structural irregularity that sometimes indicates a vessel modification made after initial construction. A door of reinforced material that the runner opened with a coded pass. The room held no furniture, a single lumen strip. The floor was bare metal, without even the standard matting that most vessel spaces install for crew comfort. A door on the far end that had not opened. "Kneel," the runner said. I knelt. The runner left. The door behind me closed. 4 minutes passed. I counted them because counting is my reflex, and I was not in a position to do anything else that would have been appropriate. The door on the far end opened. The epistolary was larger than the justicar. The justicar was large in the way of the very powerful, proportionate, capable, carrying his scale as a matter of function rather than display. The epistolary was large in a way that suggested his capacity had not yet reached its edge, that the 3.5 meters of him in that small room represented a portion of what he was rather than the whole of it. His aegis plate was covered in text more densely worked than anything on the justicar, the high Gothic filling every surface, packed into margins so small that individual characters would have been invisible at this distance if I had not known what I was looking at and therefore known where to find them. He did not speak. He stood at the far end of the room. His force weapon was sheathed. His gauntlets were removed. His hands were bare. The skin of them the grey-white of a person who has spent decades operating in void conditions. the veins of them visible at the wrist in a way that was oddly specific, oddly human, oddly wrong given the scale and nature of everything else. He was looking at me without looking at me, the way senior medicae sometimes look at a patient addressing a condition rather than a person, with a precision that is not unkind, but that is also not personal in any way the patient would recognize as regard. Then something happened to the space between us. There are no clinical terms for what the epistolary did. I have access to a medicae library, and I have read what is available under sanctioned categories, and none of it describes this accurately. What I can describe is the experience from inside it. A pressure behind my eyes that was not pain, that specifically and precisely was not pain, which I note because pain is the closest word the body offers for sustained, unfamiliar sensation, and it is not accurate here. It was more like being held still, like something very careful and very complete, placing its attention inside the architecture of my mind and moving through it with the particular focus of an auditor, not destructively, not maliciously, but with the thoroughness of someone who will not leave until they are confident they have reviewed what needs reviewing. It moved through memory. Not my memory of the corridor. I had expected that section to be the focus, and it was not avoided, but it was reached in sequence rather than isolated, reviewed in the context of the surrounding material. It moved through 3 months of postings, records, of clinical decisions, of the query I had filed about the mission's classification and the non-response I had received and filed correctly. It moved through things I had not thought of in years: a mentor's face from early training, the sound of a particular ward bell, the physical memory of a patient who did not survive and whose face I had not been able to stop reconstructing for weeks afterward. These were not taken. They were read, noted, perhaps. The sensation of being noted by something you cannot see, cannot address, cannot offer context to. It lasted 12 minutes. I counted what I could. When it ended, the pressure receded so evenly that I was not certain it had stopped until I tested the memory of the corridor and found I could access it directly without the sense of something in the way. The epistolary replaced his gauntlets. The door behind him opened and the Inquisitor entered with a document in hand. The document was 8 pages. I read it. I was not told to read it, and I was not told not to. And I am a person who reads things placed in front of me because documents matter and their precise contents matter, and I do not sign things I have not read. This is a professional commitment rather than a personality trait, but at this moment they were the same thing. The first 6 pages were formal and complete the designation of what I had witnessed as an inquisitorial classified operation under the mandate of the Ordo Malas, the delineation of my ongoing obligation to neither disclose nor discuss, nor record, nor transmit any element of it, the legal definition of what constituted disclosure and the standard of evidence required to demonstrate violation. It was thorough. It was carefully written. It was the work of someone who understood that documents of this kind would be tested eventually and wrote them so that the testing would produce the desired outcome. The 7th page described the enforcement mechanisms. It named them clearly and in order. I read this page twice. The 8th page listed 7 prior cases of oath violation. Each entry contained a case reference number, a date, a status. The status field in each entry was the same: processed order mandate. Nothing else was in the status field. No supplementary notes, no case summaries, no indication of what processed meant in the specific application of Ordo mandate, though the 7th page had made clear that the enforcement mechanisms available to the Ordo under this mandate were not constrained by the standard parameters of imperial civilian justice. The Inquisitor waited. I signed on the indicated line, in the indicated format, with the standard Munitorum issue stylus that I carried because my work requires a stylus and I carry one. My signature in my own hand went into the document. The document was placed in a case. The case was locked. A wax seal was pressed, the Ordo Malas seal, the same as on the rosette at the Inquisitor's collar, and the case was handed to an attendant and removed from the room. My name went with it into a location I could not access, under a seal I could not break, in an institution whose enforcement mechanisms I had just read described in the 7th page of a document I had signed the 8th page of. "You are free to return to your duties," the Inquisitor said. I returned. The word "free" in that sentence meant something I spent the following days measuring. Not a threat, there was nothing threatening in how it was said, no emphasis, no irony that I could identify. It was used correctly. I had been told I was free to return to my duties, and I was, functionally, free to do so, in the sense that no one was preventing me. The freedom was real. It simply had a shape now that it had not had before, defined by the document that had just been sealed, defined by the 8th page and the 7th page and the 6 pages before them. I was free to do my work. I was not free to discuss my work. These were the dimensions of what I was now. 3 days. I dressed wounds and administered medications and filed ration requests and completed the inventory I had been interrupted on the day of the corridor and began a new inventory for the rotation following. I attended the morning catechism. I slept at the correct intervals. I did not speak to anyone about anything that had happened in the cargo corridor or in the grey room or in the room with the epistolary. I did not file any non-routine reports. I maintained my function. On the morning of the 4th day, I reviewed the overnight mortality and transfer filings as part of the standard 0600 shift intake. I worked through the forms in order. In the Deck 4 assignment roster, I found 17 names. I have said that faces came before the names. This is accurate. The faces resolved first the specific quality I had tried and failed to name correctly, the piece that was absence, the expressions of men who had been emptied rather than ended. The faces resolved, and then the names matched the faces and the status field said present and active duty, and the ration allocation was current, and the equipment drawer was current, and there was nothing in any field to indicate that. 17 men in that roster were anything other than exactly what the roster said they were. I queried the record 3 times. By name, by deck assignment, by unit designation. Each query returned the same result. The paperwork generated on this vessel does not describe what happens. It describes what is required to be true. I understood this in that moment, and I understood it as a practical fact with immediate implications rather than as a philosophical observation, because philosophical observations require time and space that I did not have, and practical facts require response, and I was already formulating mine. The required truth was that 17 men were alive and on duty. The actual situation was that 17 men were in a cargo bay in 3 rows, with their faces turned upward and their expressions empty. My role in this required truth was to continue to file paperwork that aligned with the required truth, because the document in the sealed case specified that my obligation was not conditional on whether the required truth was consistent with the actual situation. I finished the morning intake and began the transit to Deck 4. The berth space was immaculate. The hammocks were made to the correct tension, the corners crisp in the way that is not natural to soldiers on long deployments, and that requires active maintenance rather than simply not being slept in. The footlockers were closed and latched. The personal items on each footlocker offering discs, folded papers in plastex, a child's drawing sealed against moisture, a worn devotional text with a ribbon marker, a small carved aquila on a cord were arranged with the same care as the hammocks. Not the arrangement of things left when someone steps away. The arrangement of things that have been placed, curated. 17 sets of effects, curated, in berths belonging to 17 men, the roster said, were present and on duty, and whose faces I had seen turned upward in a sealed cargo bay. The armsman officer appeared at the corridor entrance behind me. She was not tall. She was not particularly imposing in any physical sense. She was competent and correct, and she asked me to identify myself and state my purpose on Deck 4, which was outside my authorized movement zone. I identified myself. I stated that I had been looking for a colleague. This was not true, and it was not precise, and it was the kind of answer that works when the person asking has no particular reason to investigate further, and she had no particular reason, because I was a Munitorum pool medicae looking slightly lost on the wrong deck, which is a mundane and unthreatening thing to be. She made a notation in her duty log, small and dry, the scrape of stylus against pad. She directed me back to my authorized zone. I returned. Sitting at the supply cataloging table that the Inquisitor had used, in the bay that smelled wrong in the specific way of returned grey knights, I considered what I had built in the last hour. My movement log showed me on Deck 7 on the day of the corridor without a documented reason to be there. The supply manifest error that had originally directed me there had been corrected. I had not verified this yet, but I was already certain of it, because nothing else I had observed was accidental, and there was no reason this would be. And now my movement log showed me on Deck 4 outside my authorized zone, with an armsman notation attached. 2 unexplained entries, together, combined with anything else an audit might surface, a pattern. The audit notification arrived at 1,800. Standard practice following classified operations. All personnel records would be reviewed at 0600. Any outstanding discrepancies should be submitted to the relevant administrative section beforehand. I sat with the notice for a long time. Then I pulled my own file from the ship's Medicae registry and reviewed it. Both movement entries were present, no explanation documented for either. And I found the third element that confirmed what I had already begun to understand. The supply manifest that had originally directed me to Deck 7 had been retroactively corrected. The error no longer existed. The manifest, accessed now, showed no error at the relevant time. My presence on Deck 7 therefore had no documented cause. Someone had removed the cover. Or I turned this over through the following hours, setting the stylus down and picking it up. Setting it down again, someone had never installed it. The correction of the manifest had happened while the error was still needed, which suggested it had been corrected at the same time the door was opened early, which suggested that the manifest had never been intended as a cover, it had been a mechanism, a direction. Get this particular Medicae to this particular corridor at this particular time by providing an instruction through standard channels that they would follow, because standard instructions from the supply system are what they follow. I was on Deck 7 because I was supposed to be on Deck 7. The door opened early because it was opened. These were not conclusions I reached with ease or speed. They assembled themselves over the 5 hours between my review of the file and the first light of the ship's morning cycle, during which I sat at the cataloging table and did not file any amendments, and did not submit any reports, and did not sleep. At 0600, the audit official arrived. Middle-aged, administratum, a portable registry unit, and the expression of someone who has reviewed enough personnel files to have long ago stopped expecting them to be interesting. She worked through the Medicae pool systematically. She reached my file at 0912. She spent 22 seconds on it. She stamped it, cleared, and moved to the next. I had been awake since the previous evening, and I watched her stamp with the specific clarity of prolonged wakefulness, which is a kind of forced attentiveness, all the non-essential processing gone, and only the essential remaining. The stamp landed on my file, audible, definitive, and she moved on. The Deck 4 entry was not in the file she reviewed. The armsman's notation, the small, dry scraping that had followed me out of the Deck 4 corridor, was gone, not flagged as reviewed and cleared, absent. Removed from the record before the audit ran by someone with sufficient administrative access to do so without creating a log of the action, or with sufficient administrative access to create a log of the action that was also removed, which would require a greater degree of access and a greater degree of anticipation. Someone had anticipated the Deck 4 entry, had known it would be there, had known when the audit was scheduled, had intervened at the correct moment. This is the thing I spent the 3 days following the audit understanding, and the thing I have continued to understand since, in iterations, at intervals, the understanding deepening each time I returned to it with new information. I had not avoided scrutiny through my own careful behavior. My behavior had not been the relevant variable. I had been managed through scrutiny by someone who treated my continued function as something worth maintaining, which meant my continued function was useful, which meant the adept on the supply run was not an unexpected variable in a sealed corridor, but a selected one whose behavior afterward was anticipated and whose record was being maintained. I was not a witness who had been processed and released. I was a resource whose value was in the processing. On the third day after the audit, I was conducting routine inventory of the surgical supply cases delivered in the morning rotation when I found the card. It was between the second and third layer of surgical sponges, not dropped in at random, placed flat against the interior wall of the case in an orientation that would make the text readable when the sponges were lifted in the standard removal sequence. The standard removal sequence requires lifting the top 2 layers first. Someone who placed this card knew the sequence and positioned the card so that I would encounter it in the course of correct procedure, not in the course of searching for it. The card was old. The edges had softened with extended handling, the specific softness of paper that has been carried in a pocket or between items for years, handled enough times that the fibers have begun to release their crispness at the margins. It had not been placed here recently. It had been kept and then placed here deliberately. The header bore the Ordo Malas seal. The code designation of the operation matched the one I had signed the non-disclosure oath for. The date was 3 years prior. The notation described the attachment of a secundus medicae of the Munitorum pool to this vessel for an operation under this code designation. The name of that medicae, partially redacted, 1 letter of the given name remaining, the family name struck through. Beneath the notation, a transfer record. The medicae had been transferred at the operation's conclusion to another vessel, destination specified. The Litany of Sorrows. I read the card 4 times, once for the information, once to verify I had read it correctly, once slowly, working through the implications of each element in order, once more, because I needed to read the final line again with the full weight of the prior 3 readings accumulated. I retrieved, from the section of my memory I had been reviewing continuously since the corridor, the header of my own pre-mission assignment orders. Standard Munitorum channel orders, issued 3 months ago, specifying my attachment to the Throne Adamant for the duration of the current classified operation and my transfer destination at operation's conclusion. The transfer destination had been in those orders for 3 months. The Litany of Sorrows. I was already going there before the corridor, before the oath, before the audit. Before the door opened 40 seconds early, and I looked up and counted 17 bodies in 3 rows. The destination of my next posting had been decided before any of this began, which meant the decision of what would happen to me after the corridor had been made before the corridor had been arranged, which meant the corridor had been arranged by someone who already knew what came after. This is the moment at which I understood the full shape of what I was in. I put the card in my breast pocket. I completed the inventory. I submitted the inventory results through the correct channel, and they were received and catalogued and assigned a reference number. The following morning I was summoned. The Inquisitor's office was warm, above standard ship temperature measurably, physically warmer than the adjacent corridor, warmer than the Medicae deck, warmer than anywhere on this vessel I had spent time, a warmth that requires deliberate energy expenditure to maintain against the void, and that a person maintains only when they have decided that the maintenance cost is worth the result. It was not opulent. It was warm in the specific way of someone who has found the one comfort they permit themselves and applies it consistently. He thanked me by name. He said my conduct throughout the operation had been exemplary. He reviewed the commendation document, which was already drafted and stamped with a seal I recognized as Munitorum standard, the kind that goes into personnel files and remains there as the documented record of a period of service. He said I had managed a sensitive situation with appropriate restraint. He used the word sensitive without defining what situation he meant. He said this was exactly the kind of professional conduct the Ordo valued in attached personnel. He shook my hand. The grip was correct. Duration. Pressure. The professional warmth of imperial convention, the grip you learn in administrative training, because it matters that the person being greeted registers it as appropriate, not too long and not too brief, not too firm and not insufficient. A perfect handshake, I thought. This is what correctness looks like from inside it. The room warm, the grip correct, the commendation stamped. The commendation documented me as cooperative, professionally appropriate, and satisfied. Commended, this entry would exist in my file as the permanent record of my experience aboard this vessel. Any account I might give that differed from this framing would be compared to this entry and found to conflict with the documented record of a commended and cooperative secundus medicae who had managed a sensitive situation appropriately. He informed me at the end of the meeting that my next posting had been finalized. He described a larger vessel, better resourced, a medicae bay with newer equipment and a fuller team. He said, "Consider it an advancement." He said the vessel's name. I received it as confirmation. I accepted the commendation. I thanked him. I returned to my station. I attempted to retrieve my own personnel file from the ship's medicae registry to verify the commendation entry had been correctly filed. The query returned record not found. I searched by name, by identification code, by posting date, each search, record not found. I walked to the administratum window and presented my identification to the clerk. He looked at it and looked at me and said I did not appear on the current manifest. I showed him the commendation stamp. He said that was an Ordo document and he could not access Ordo files. I thanked him and returned to the bay. I held, simultaneously, a commendation stamp that proved I existed and a ship's manifest that contained no record of me. I was real in Ordo paperwork. I was absent from the systems I had been using for 3 months. The space where my record had been was occupied now by the correct manifest number, which summed correctly, which indicated that from the ship's administrative perspective, the complement was exactly as it should be and had not recently lost anything. My berth, when I returned that evening, held my personal effects in standard transfer cases. The name tag on the berth frame had been replaced with a blank. Transfer to the Litany of Sorrows was not occurring upon return to port. It was occurring. The shuttle was listed as departing from Bay 3 at 0340. I was on it. The crew were Munitorum standard and treated the transit as routine and spoke to me only when procedure required it. The Litany of Sorrows was larger than the Throne Adamant. I felt this in the scale of the shuttle bay that received us, the greater reverberation of the docking cycle, the longer transit from docking collar to the medicae deck. The medicae primus met me at 0415. She had a duty roster and a berth assignment, and the manner of a person who has performed this intake many times and performs it correctly. She reviewed the transfer papers. Everything was in order. She showed me to the bay. It was good. I registered this immediately, and it continued to register across the following days. The quality of the equipment, the organization of the storage, the calibration of the monitoring units, the layout of the procedural space. It was a well-designed bay. Someone who understood field medicine had designed it. The resources were real. The team was competent. The shift rotation gave adequate rest. The caseload was consistent with what the vessel's operational profile suggested. It was a good posting. I stood in the entrance and understood that this was not a punishment. This was not exile. This was an assignment, a correct, ongoing, professional assignment to a good posting on a capable vessel. This was what came after. Not ending. Continuation. The Primus informed me the 0600 shift started in 2.5 hours. She offered the time for rest. She returned to her office. I did not rest. I did my work. The 0600 shift, 3 wound dressings from residual casualties of a prior engagement, 4 scheduled medication doses, supervision of 2 junior medics, a supply inventory amendment, a morning summary to the Primus. All correct, all filed, all catalogued. During the transit from medication storage to the main bay in the second hour, I passed a wall rack of identification tags. Standard Munitorum issue, the kind given to attached personnel. Small metal rectangles, name and role and posting date. One tag was oriented facing outward, which is not standard. I slowed. The posting date was 2 years ago. The role was Secundus Medicae. The name was partially obscured by the tag's position in the rack. The first letter of the given name was visible. It matched the first letter on the card in my breast pocket, the letter I had been reading since the supply case. I did not pull the tag from the rack. I continued to the medication storage, retrieved what I needed, and returned to the bay. At the end of the first week of my posting, I was settling the supply drawer in my berth standard practice when taking a new posting, checking what the previous occupant left, ensuring the space is configured correctly for the work it will hold. The previous occupant had been thorough. The drawer was nearly empty. Nearly. A stylus, standard Munitorum issue, indistinguishable from every other stylus produced in the same lot. Except for what had been done to it, a name engraved on the barrel in small, careful characters, private work, not Munitorum standard. The kind of engraving you take a tool to have done in port at some cost because you want the thing to carry your name after the posting rotation has filed you somewhere you cannot be reached. The name on the barrel was the name on the card, almost entirely. The given name's first letter, the one from the tag in the corridor, the one on the card was the one I had been reading. The rest of it was here, in the metal, under my thumb, in the specific physical persistence of someone who had decided that their name on a Munitorum stylus was a fact worth the cost of making permanent. I held the stylus for a long time. I did not discard it. I placed it in my breast pocket with the card. The following morning I used it to sign the first mortality report of my posting on the Litany of Sorrows. A guardsman. Wound infection, field dressing insufficient. Delay in transit extending the intervention window past the point where intervention was sufficient. This is a common cause. This is a preventable cause given different resourcing at the field level. The documentation required was standard. I completed it in the standard format. I signed on the indicated line with the stylus I was carrying and submitted the report, and it was catalogued and assigned a record number. The record number is 317 in my career total. I continued to the next task. This is the Litany of Sorrows at the third hour of the evening shift, with the casualty load low and the junior medics in their rest cycle, and the monitoring equipment making the sounds of stable patients and the incense from the ecclesiarchy shrine 3 decks down coming through the ventilation A, sweetness beneath the antiseptic, present and consistent, the smell I now know as the smell of the hours between tasks. Between the completion of one form and the beginning of the next, between one scheduled obligation and the next scheduled obligation, the card is in my breast pocket. The stylus is in my breast pocket. The prior Secundus Medicae's name is in the metal under my thumb when I reach for it. I do not know if that Medicae is alive. I do not know if alive is the applicable category, given what I now understand about the range of outcomes available to people who pass through this particular administrative process. I do not know if they reached an ending or a continuation. I have carried their name for 6 months, and I cannot use it to find them, and I will not file a query because filing a query would constitute the kind of behavior that produces the kind of record entries that I understand now have consequences. What I know is that they were here, that they stood in this bay in the third hour of the evening shift, with the incense in the air and the monitoring equipment steady, that they took a Munitorum issue stylus at some cost to themselves and had their name worked into the metal, that they kept it long enough to wear the edges of the card they also kept, that they placed these things where I would find them in the correct sequence, without address, without explanation, without anything that would constitute a message that could be found and read as a message by anyone who had not already arrived at the conclusion the things themselves confirmed. They were here. They knew they were here. They put their name on something so it would still be true after they could no longer say it. My hands are over the form. The monitoring equipment reports what it reports. The incense comes through the ventilation at the correct concentration for this time of the evening cycle. My hands are holding the stylus with the name in the metal, and the form requires a signature, and I provide the signature and submit the form, and the form is catalogued. Sometimes, between one motion and the next, the hands slow, not from trembling, from nothing. An interval between the completion of one correct action and the beginning of the next correct action, during which the hands simply decelerate, holding whatever they are holding, the stylus over the form, or the dressing strip between the fingers, or the medication dosage prepared and waiting, and there is a pause without clinical cause. The pause passes. The hands resume. They always resume.